Hi everyone, my name is Corey. I was and am a debater at Queen's University, and today I'm going to be giving you an introduction to framing. It's not going to be an exhaustive guide, but it's going to be really good at starting to help you think about what framing is and what the different kinds of framing are and how you can implement it strategically in your speeches. Okay, so how should you conceptualize framing? I think framing should be thought of as what is relevant in the debate, and you're trying to tell the judge how they should adjudicate the debate. So, if we think about arguments in debate at the most macro level, there's really two aspects to them. First, there's how true the arguments are. And I think this is intuitively what most people try to focus on debate in a lot of ways. But the second aspect of an argument that's just as important and could sometimes be even more important is how relevant that argument is. So you want to think about like the arguments on like an X and Y axis about like how true it is and how relevant it is. You want it to obviously be a good combination of both, and sometimes it's going to be more strategically beneficial to focus on the truth of your arguments, but sometimes it's going to be more strategically beneficial to focus on the relevancy of those arguments. Because at the end of the day, if a motion isn't relevant to the actual, if an argument isn't relevant to the actual motion that you're talking about, then it doesn't really actually have any weight in changing the judge's mind. Even if you have a very large impact in the argument you're saying, if that impact doesn't directly pertain to the debate that we're having, it's not really that helpful for like helping you in the debate. It might be like a useful, smart thing to say in general, but just strategically in terms of placing high in the debate, it might not be the best thing. So the best arguments have framing and analysis proving why it's true, and usually it's a balancing act. So we'll go through a couple motions and a couple different types of framing just to get you a really good idea on it. So the motion we'll talk about first is this House would distribute wealth from high income sports teams to lower income sports teams. So, framing in this debate might include a mention of how a fundamental ideal in sports is competition. So, this is the framing that the government team would do. They would say that if we can redistribute the wealth to a lower income sports team, now what's going to happen is instead of having the 4 or 5 richest teams in the leagues being completely dominant, we're probably going to see smaller teams be more competitive. And in turn, this is going to make it so that we have a better form of competition. So the framing from government in redistributing income in sports leagues is that competition is better for everybody when it's on an equal playing field. And that's just the government team telling the judge how they should adjudicate the round. But opposition might contest this framing. Opposition might come up here and say, we don't think that the best form of competition is having 30 teams with like all equally the same rosters or like some closer semblance of that competing against each other. We think the better form of competition is like in the NBA when we have super teams with like Steph Curry on one team and LeBron James on the other team and going in the finals. We think that's a better form of competition. And then the framing in this round can come down to like, why is that better? So you could talk about how sports are businesses in a lot of cases and how competition being exciting means that they're going to have more fans. So talking about that is another piece of framing saying that's why we should care about this good the most in the debate. Notice how everything I'm saying isn't actually talking about why these things are true or not. It's not talking about why, if government actually does make sports a more equal playing field. And it's not talking about if opposition actually does make sports more exciting or it does make sports more money. It's just talking about what the judge should care about. You then need to prove those other things later through your analysis. So this is just to kind of exemplify that you need framing in a round, talking about why your argument is important and proving why it's true. And usually, sometimes, you can accept the framing that the other team gives you if you think that you can beat them on that framing. But sometimes, don't let a team just frame you into a position that's going to be strategically bad for you. You know, you're allowed to contest framing, and sometimes that might be like the largest qualm that you have with another team in the debate. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple different types of framing, and it's just important to note that not every technique is as relevant as others in a different round. Sometimes you're going to have to prove much more difficult things than other rounds of debate. Sometimes you're going to have to prove much more specific things. So it's about just learning these as tools to have in your toolbox. So when you come to a motion where you think it's relevant, then you'll be able to use it. Okay. So one specific type of framing, burdens. So you're going to, in the case with burdens, you tell the judge what you need to do to win the debate. Sometimes it's going to be like explicitly clear to you what you need to do to win the debate. Other times you might be a little bit lost. Just like an example of this is the motion we'll talk about is this House believes that the United States should never assassinate the leader of terrorist organizations. So an opposition team in this debate might want to frame it as we don't need to prove that always assassinating the leaders of terrorist organizations is a good tactic for the United States. An opposition team could frame it as we just need to prove that there's a small subset of opportunities in which this is a very smart strategy to pursue. Whereas the government team the government team does have to prove that in every single instance, the assassination of the heads of terrorist organization leads to a worse outcome. A government team might know that that's their burden, but since that's a difficult burden, they might not want to draw a lot of focus on that framing. Thus, for the government team, maybe talking about your burdens might not be the most strategically sound thing, and you just hope that the opposition teams aren't going to mention it. Your analysis on government should still prove why it's never all right to do that, but through clever wording and style, you might want to try and draw a little bit less focus to that very heavy burden. Whereas for the opposition team, that framing is actually very strategic for them. So they might want to draw a lot of focus on that. It's not the case that in every single debate it's going to be perfectly balanced, and you might want to utilize that knowledge to you. So that's just an example of burdens in some cases. Okay, the second type of framing that you can do. You can talk about stakeholders in this debate. Oftentimes in debate, you're going to be talking about why what you're arguing for is going to lead to people having a better outcome in a lot of ways. But sometimes the benefits that people receive in the debates we talk about are going to be in clash with other groups. So you need to argue for why the group that you represent on your side of the house is more important, more deserving, or why it's better to give to those people than the group that the government or opposition is advocating for. So the example of this debate is this House believes that we should prioritize climate change adaptation instead of climate change prevention. So the framing on this from government might be, okay, if we're prioritizing adaptation can happen in the moment right now, and it can also make it so people are not dying of climate change. But then the opposition might come in frame and say, yes, but climate change is very expensive to pursue adaptation, which means that the people that you're advocating for do get saved in the short term. However, you're advocating for a much smaller group of people. Climate change prevention means that we're changing all of the economies and structures on Earth to make it so that climate change is no longer going to happen. So the stakeholder framing that you can do on opposition is prevention helps everybody. So that's a better group of people for you to care about because we're able to help more people. Whereas the government, if you can prove on opposition that adaptation is expensive and doesn't benefit everybody, then the framing in that round makes it so government is advocating for a much smaller group of people. Then, from that point, if you're able to do the analysis to prove that your framing is true and that the actual mechanisms and arguments in your speech are true, that should be a recipe for you doing very well in the debate. There is a little bit of a crossover, as you might notice, between framing and the analysis in your arguments. However, there is a good crossover between them, and they're not as separate as many people think in a lot of ways. It's just always good to think about framing as the larger why you should care, and the argumentative as why what I'm saying is true. I think that's a good way to conceptualize it. Another thing that you can do is you can use framing in your refutation. So, oftentimes in debate, you might see a team come up and give one set of framing for their first argument and then a different set of framing for their other argument. Oftentimes in debate, we try and prove a lot of arguments. It might not always be the best course of action to run 3 or 4 arguments in a speech, but like sometimes separate arguments require separate framing to prove why they're relevant, if the arguments are very different in nature. So if you notice that a team has different parts of framing in their speech, it might be strategically advantageous for you to attack what you consider their weaker framing or their stronger framing if you can take it down. But also, that's to say that you can just not refute an argument on the basis of truth, you can also refute an argument on the basis of relevance. So if you hear something from a government team or an opposition team and you think, wow, that sounds like rock solid, that's really hard for me to disprove, there's a lot of strong logical links in there. Well, you can think to yourself, okay, well, it's very true, but is it the most relevant thing to this debate? Does what the other team proved actually help who the most important people in this debate are? Because going back to the last form of framing, of stakeholder framing, if you see that like the government proves something super true, but it only benefits a small amount of people, then you can say, well, that doesn't actually lead to a better outcome for everybody because you're advocating for a much smaller set of people. Sometimes that framing won't win you the round. Sometimes advocating for a smaller group of people is the strategic thing to do, just out of necessity in a lot of cases. But sometimes that's going to be a strategic avenue for you to run your refutation or argumentation through. Okay, the last type of framing we'll talk about. Framing by moral frameworks. So, framing by moral frameworks is you're basically kind of giving the judge a recipe for how to judge the debate. So, for instance, a very common one that we go by in debate in a lot of cases is utilitarianism. Like, the argument that I made provides the greatest amount of benefits for the greatest amount of people. And that's a moral framework that people like, even if they don't explicitly say that they're committing to, through the way that they structure their arguments and follow through their cases, that is a moral framework that they kind of prescribe to throughout their speeches. So, if you learn about other different types of moral frameworks, maybe consequentialism, where you just say, it doesn't matter about what's best for the largest group of people, all that matters is like at the end of the day what the end goal is. But you can also refute and contest people's moral frameworks. So for instance, the motion we'll use for this is, this House believes it's all right to torture a terrorist if you know that they have information that's going to save lives. So the government team gets to say, well, you know, it's all right for us to sacrifice the life of one person if we're able to get information that saves the lives of 1,000 people. However, if you're opposition, that sounds like pretty solid, but you might there's like clever ways that you can contest that utilitarian background. You can point out problems with utilitarianism, such as, you know, if we were to like force someone who is dying to give up their lungs or organs to save 5 people, we wouldn't allow that to happen. So why would we be all right with like forcing this person to do something if it leads to other people's lives? You could point out that more utilitarianism oftentimes has clashes with how humans fundamentally conceive morality, so it shouldn't be the moral framework that you judge this entire debate by, even though punishing that one person to save 1,000 people's lives might help 1,000 people. That person that terrorist might be in that position because of factors that are out of his control, and it's morally reprehensible to punish that person for that position. So for instance, if the United States military campaigns left Afghanistan in a very bad position of poverty, people might need to do very hard things to survive in a lot of circumstances, and to like punish and torture that human being and put him through completely dehumanizing activities, it might be wrong to punish that person for that. It might be so wrong that in fact that like we should like ban torturing of terrorists as a method at all, as like we've seen has happened in like pop culture in a lot of cases. So it's just, if you see that a team is making a moral framework that seems really rock solid and that's like their entire case is resting upon it, then like try and take that part of their case out, and that'll probably put you in a more strategic way. Okay, so that's just a couple different forms of framing, and that's just a good way to get you started to go. I hope that was helpful. Have a good day.